legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat. My guest today is Brian Francis Culkin. Even by 21st century standards, 2020 has been a tumultuous year. To mounting economic, social and political problems was added the coronavirus crisis, the response to which has inflicted widespread economic devastation, huge social disruption and untold human misery, all of which exposes the hollowed out core of our collective culture, whose saturation in media and technology and slavish devotion to scientism is arguably now doing more harm than good. Identity politics, cancel culture, and even the pandemic itself have been politicized and weaponized, functioning as cover for technocratic agendas, distractions from more pressing real-world problems, and blinding us from the deeper psycho-spiritual causes of our current malaise.
Hello and welcome, Brian, and thank you so much for joining us again on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you for having me.
Today, Brian, we find ourselves here at the end of 2020, a tumultuous year by anybody's standards, possibly the most tumultuous year that any of us currently alive have lived through. Before we dive into that, for listeners who don't know, if you could tell people a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Yeah, so I'm a writer and a film director, and I guess a cultural theorist, you could say. And I've written a series of books. I've written 13 books, with a few more coming out next year as well. And I've directed 3 films. And my interest, I guess, lies in the intersection of technology, capitalism, spirituality, and globalization. Kind of analyzing the different structures and forms that we are seeing in the context of 21st century globalization, and how that affects our consciousness and our day-to-day life, really.
Obviously, two of the biggest events of this year, the two biggest events of this year, the pandemic, which we're currently navigating our way through or trying to, and the US election. And you don't have to be interested in politics or pay any attention to politics to understand why that was so important. But here in the UK, we're also attempting to navigate our way through the back end of Brexit, which of course was the UK's decision to depart the European Union. Now, all of these tumultuous events that have been read very differently by different commentators, but I see them all intimately interconnected, and I think you do as well. And I also see these as symptoms of a deeper malaise.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I would agree with that. With what you're saying, that there's an interconnected feature between, certainly in terms of the Trump phenomenon in American politics and Brexit. And then also how, even though something like COVID was a biological event, it spontaneously emerged in the Chinese city of Wuhan, it is related, very much so, to, it might not be related in and of itself as a biological event, but it became related in the way that in the way our political thinking responded to it. So there's definitely a tapestry that's being weaved between these three moments or structure that you just mentioned, amidst other ones as well.
Now, what inspired our chat was, I'm obviously a reader of your online posts, your blogging, and your currently putting together a new collection of those spontaneous reflections too, which is going to, build on your previous volume there. And one thing that interested me very much, particularly this year with the pandemic, was you talking about a cultural immune system. Of course, there's a lot of talk about immune system with the biological specifics of the pandemic, but perhaps you could say what you mean by a cultural immune system.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the idea of immune system works on two different levels. The first is most certainly on the biological level. And in a very simple way, people who have healthy immune systems or robust immune systems, they have the capacity or the ability to keep out foreign agents, such as bacteria, virus, parasites. And when such agents do infiltrate the body, they have the capacity to, be sick for a little while and eventually expel those agents from the organism. And, someone who's compromised, who has an immune system that is compromised, of course, they have to be very careful because they're unable, their immune system is really unable to protect foreign entities coming in and invading, the cells and molecules of their own body. So the immune system conceptually is an apparatus or some kind of form that says this can come in, this can't come in. And when you transpose that idea onto a culture, all cultures, you would think, to be healthy, should have a cultural immune system. And you certainly see this in indigenous cultures. And I think to a point you saw this in Western European cultures up until recently, where there were certain things that were allowed in public space and certain things that weren't. And I think with the advent of 21st century capitalist globalization, which is totally linked to the unbelievable array, very powerful computational technologies that have emerged from places like Silicon Valley, the cultural immune system of America has been shattered. I mean, we're unable to protect children from pornography. We're unable to protect ourselves from all kinds of misinformation and terrible ideas and bad actors infiltrating our public space. And one of the things that I was noticing about the political response to the COVID-19 crisis was that it was absolutely focused on our individual biological immune systems. It wasn't even when people were talking about public health, I always felt that it was very self-centered and really focused on the individual. But what there was zero talk about was the cultural immune system and how, we are living, I can speak for America, I can't entirely speak for England, but I think they're similar in many ways, is that we are living in a situation where the cultural immune system of America has been completely shattered. We have no way to protect ourselves from, viral videos and memes and all these things that are invading the collective or social brain of American society. And of course, this is causing all kinds of problems from, depression and anxiety to more extreme psychopathologies like bipolar syndrome. So, and, a very interesting thinker for me was the French anthropologist René Girard, who's written a lot about plagues and what he says is these things are intimately linked, that if you have a strong cultural immune system, then you're much less likely to allow a biological plague to enter into public space and affect individuals. And on the contrary, if your cultural immune system is completely broken down in the sense that, foreign invaders can come in and in our era, technological incursion can just come into any home that, you think about the average family dynamic today. You have, 4 people sitting around a table all looking at their smartphones with different information coming in. I mean, a dynamic like that is inherently unhealthy in the sense that all this kind of technological bacteria and technological parasites can infiltrate not only the family home, but cultural space at large. And when we live in an environment like that, then yes, something like COVID has a much better chance to come into a social dynamic like that and do real damage. And I think that's one of the lessons of COVID-19 is that the cultural protective mechanisms of that have been obliterated by the globalization process. It has allowed a biological plague, a biological virus like COVID-19 that really, I mean, I don't want to downplay the potential problems with COVID-19 because people are dying and people are getting sick. But at the same time, you know, it's a 1% death rate or something like that. So it's, you know, we're not dealing with the bubonic plague or Ebola. You know, we're dealing with a particularly strong pneumonia, basically. But still, it's been able to come in and just cause unbelievable chaos and havoc and hysteria and these really non-optimal political responses. So I think that's what I was trying to get at, is that not only is there such a thing as a cultural immune system, right? Because the biological immune system is a real thing. It's a material entity. Whereas in the sense that it can be verified, its presence can be verified by science. Whereas a cultural immune system is more of a concept. It's a kind of like a Platonic form. It's an idea. But it's there, though. It's real. And I think that we only talk about our biological immune system. And the reason why we don't talk about our cultural immune system is because part of the logic of capitalist globalization, it has turned us all into like private consumers, where there is no real intersubjective matrix of communal life anymore. We've been reduced to ourselves and our technological output and our productive capacities, and that's it. And I think, you know, COVID-19, I mean, it doesn't, if anything, this kind of pervasive selfishness seems to be getting worse. But I think that if there was any kind of message, you could say, or kind of higher spiritual vibratory message of COVID-19, it's to rediscover that cultural immune system, our shared social space, and our codependence on one another as human beings.
Yes, I think it's so interesting what you say, and I think if you attempt to approach what's happening with the pandemic on a purely 5-sense materialistic level, you will never get to grips with it.
Exactly.
It cannot be fully understood on that level. No. And I think that you pointed out about the actual reality of it in terms of infection and death rates, and how we've seen so much worse in the past. And I think that a societies or global society differently orientated, more balanced, would see this thing off in short order. It would be dealt with very differently. And I think that I spoke earlier about the US election, about how the divisions in US society and the divisions here in the UK and around Europe, actually. Yeah, divisions in the UK revealed by Brexit, divisions in Europe between North and South revealed in recent years in currency crises and what have you. And I think that the cohesion of society will tell you a lot about how it meets a crisis. And it seems to me that, even those of us who were observing US social and political culture and, a bit dismayed by what we saw, even we were taken aback by how poorly prepared the US was to meet the challenges of the pandemic. Because, this is like the leader of the free world, the most advanced nation. I don't think so. So even I was like, wow, I can't believe the fracturing and the disintegration taking place, in the US.
Yeah, it was. And, one of the many problems in contemporary American society is that society itself has become privatized. So if this were to happen, let's say in the 1960s and 1970s, there would have been a much more coherent, robust public response. Whereas today, a lot of the governmental functions of American society have been privatized by corporations and technological power. So, and because a lot of that has happened over the past 20 to 30 years, and we really haven't dealt with a pandemic like this, the response has been very fragmented and disorganized. And also, too, there is something about the American media apparatus that takes this kind of what in psychoanalytic terminology, it's called jouissance. It's like this surplus enjoyment, this kind of perverted enjoyment in making America look bad. I mean, when you look at the major news stations of America, like CNN and NBC and ABC, I mean, they almost took pleasure, they almost took enjoyment in highlighting how bad America was doing. It was a bizarre thing. And I think that, yes, America did not do great. However, the American testing apparatus was unbelievable. And so many of the cases that America is reporting on a daily basis, 250,000 cases a day, a large majority of those, and we don't even know for sure, are completely asymptomatic people. So and then of course the hysterical nature of both the media, the traditional media, coupled with the social media ecology. I mean, it gives it this kind of hysterical nature where everything is presented and to display the absolute shock value. So this isn't necessarily yes, to agree with you, the American response was not good. President Trump's response was not good, but also there's a whole media ecology beneath that, and the environment that has been created by these network technologies of how we interact with one another that inherently makes the situation worse. It makes the situation more frantic and manic and discombobulated. So again, we're dealing with plagues on different levels. We're dealing with a biological plague in the form of COVID-19. We're dealing with a technological plague in terms of surplus technology applied to the human nervous system. And then we're also dealing with a plague of information and a plague of depression and all these different plagues that seem to 2020 was the year when they all kind of linked together and caused a real planetary crisis.
Yeah, you mentioned a few moments ago something about indigenous societies, and one thing that they, even those that still exist today in any meaningful form, seem to have is a way of seeing clearly that we seem to have lost, to be able to judge something and to be, but of course we're discouraged from doing that now. You can't call a spade a spade. I don't know if you have that expression in the US, but we have it here. It's like just say what you see.
Sure.
And also that I think, I don't know if you've written about this, but the concept of evil, I think that our dismissal of that in postmodern times has been quite disastrous. And I think it's one thing that indigenous societies were able to see, to call it out, to judge it, to know how to deal with it, to dispatch it.
But that's also, I think that what defines, and again, I live in the Peruvian Amazon in the city of Quito, so I'm kind of surrounded by many different indigenous cultures, and I've personally learned a lot from them just being down there. And I think one of the things that defines an indigenous culture is a kind of a symbolic coherence, and in the sense that there's a certain lens by which you're viewing social reality, and that gives a consistency to how people approach the world. But in terms of evil, I don't think it's just indigenous culture. I would definitely argue that the entire history of Western Christianity up until recently has always been in touch with this idea that there is evil in the world. C.S. Lewis once said that we're living in enemy-occupied territory. And I think recently, with, as you correctly say, with the rise of postmodernity and contemporary hypermodernity, we have lost that idea of evil, that there is evil in the world. And in many ways, and one of the things that I've written about is that the whole discourse of politically correct, or what it's called now is woke discourse, is in many ways a de-Christianized Christianity. It's Christianity in the sense that, the key anthropological insight of Christianity is a defense of the victim. It's defense, and that of course is Christ. Christ symbolizes the victim who's being taken over by the crowd. And woke terminology and politically correct discourse, it is a defense of the victim, but it's not so much to defend the the dignity of the victim is to kind of make us all into victims. So it's this kind of perverted Christianity that we're seeing emerge as like the key ideological feature of 21st century globalization. And that's something that's very concerning, I think, in many ways. But I would totally agree with you that one of the features of postmodernity or hypermodernity is without question this kind of disregard of evil.
Well, the whole woke cancel culture thing, again, is that feeds what I was mentioning a moment ago about not being able to name what you see. You can't call something what it is.
Sure.
Developing that thought further, I see it as, if not completely, certainly the opportunity for a vast distraction from what I would call actual problems, if you see what I mean. So, like Jordan Peterson has spoken about this and been shot down in flames for it. Anything we can do to ninny and obsess about gender fluid toilets or something, anything whatsoever, rather than face what's coming at us.
Yes, but that's precisely why wokeness or PC discourse has become the theological accompaniment of global capitalism. This is why all of the major corporations and all of the major media outlets and the whole ecology of celebrities that are immersed within that matrix, they're all woke. They're all ultra PC, because it diverts our attention from this monstrous abstraction that is coming towards us very, very quickly. So yes, I would agree with that as well.
There was a very interesting post that you did, I can't remember exactly when it was, during the last year, about the whole, around the protests, the Black Lives Matter, but also the cancel culture tearing down of statues and vandalizing of heritage sites. Whatever you think about the past, look, bad shit happened, it continually does. The history isn't black and white, but you made a point about the future, Microsoft and Apple, and their business practices and how statues of, Steve Jobs or, Bill Gates or whatever,
Sure.
I enjoyed that.
I remember that. I remember that post. Well, yeah, I mean, it's just this idea of there is tremendous disturbance, psychological, economic, symbolic, in the world today. And I think that one of the things that we tend to do, and this is normal, I don't think it makes somebody a bad person, but is that we tend to look for scapegoats of why this has happened. And certainly with the emergence of these mass protests over the summer of 2020 following the really horrific and horrifying murder of George Floyd, was this scapegoating of the past. This this is all there because of white privilege and certain historical figures that have made it like this. And that might be true, right? Like, there is no doubt that a country like America has this really horrific history of racism that is there. It has had a very detrimental effect on the African American soul and individual lives. There is no doubt about that. But the point that I was getting at is that when we try to blame the past entirely, what we tend to overlook is the present. And I think that, and if we keep going in this direction, we could easily imagine in the year, 2200 or 2300, people tearing down the statues of Bill Gates, or people tearing down the statues of Jeff Bezos. Because, when you look at, or Apple, Steve Jobs, I mean, Steve Jobs almost has a saint-like figure in terms of the globalization matrix, right? When he died, it was like a saint was dying. But, when people look back on Apple's business practices and their use of borderline slave labor in Chinese factories, that's going to raise a lot of questions. So I think that what we tend to do is we tend to scapegoat the past. And I believe in that post, I used an analogy from a gospel dialogue that Christ had with the Pharisees to kind of illustrate that point. But yeah, and so we have to, we have to be aware of the past and we have to be historically literate, but we also have to be aware of the present and see how we're reproducing systems of injustice and under a different guise. And that's what I think when woke, or whatever you want to call it, politically correct discourse becomes obsessed with past systems of oppression and past figures of oppression without looking at their own participation in contemporary systems of oppression, that's problematic to me.
Well, I spent many years, in fact, it's only in the last couple of years that I withdrew from it for various reasons. I spent many years as a cultural critic, specifically a music critic. And I noticed towards the end of the 1990s, this trend towards recycling the past, basically. And I naively thought, well, it's the year 2000, and when we get into the 21st century, maybe there's a lot of anxiety, as there historically always has been with the approach of a new millennium. Maybe when we get into the 21st century, we can move on from this, and we'll see some new cultural forms emerging, and we won't be just churning through the past quite so much. And then, to my horror, what actually happened post...
It's gotten much worse.
Yes, exactly.
Much worse.
And I don't know if I mentioned Simon Reynolds to you in his book Retromania, but that's a very good go-to if anybody wants to, just remind themselves of what we've all been doing in the last few years.
Sure.
And you had a post about 1980s music in malls, which again, it really resonated with me and I enjoyed very much. And the point of all this is it's a symptom, that we're looking to the past for a reason, because the future at best appears to be opaque.
Yeah, and I think another really lucid example of that was about a month ago. There was a fight between Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. These were fighters in the 1980s and 1990s. And when you think about that, it's in the 1980s, you never would have staged a fight between, Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali or something like that, because they were from the past, they were from their era, and they were fighters in the present fighting in their era. And I think when you look at the remakes of so many movies and so many television shows, that is speaking to an existential crisis, that we're unable to develop new cultural forms. We're unable to produce a future. We're kind of colonizing the past to prop ourselves up. But what that speaks to is a disintegrating culture, where we're using the past to prop ourselves up from really collapsing. And this is happening in sport, it's happening in cinema, it's happening in television, it's happening in music, and it absolutely speaks to a crisis of I guess you could say, the soul of society, in the sense that it's unable to produce a vision for the future. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the new temporality of computational time. I think in a very simple way, you could say that history has been set in three different temporal models. The first we could call like the agricultural or the indigenous model, when time is experienced as a cosmic rhythm, the passage of the cycles of the moon, the seasons, the movement of the sun across the sky. And that was in place really from the earliest human cultures up until from, like the Enlightenment to the rise of industrialization. So it began to shift between the 17th and 19th centuries. And then you get this new temporal model, which is based upon clocks and railway tables. And it's just, it's moving away from the natural rhythms of the biosphere into mechanical clocks and the standardization of time. And then in the 1990s, we come into this new temporality, which we could call digital time, where like our sense of time, whether we are conscious of it or not, it's certainly not governed by a cosmic rhythm or natural cycles. But at the same time, it's not really governed by clocks anymore. It's governed by the internal movement of what we call real time, of computational time. And that is creating a crisis in our experience. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about today is like no one has any time for anything. Where did all of it go? You know what I mean? Like, where did all of the time go? And it seems to me as if like the time is being sucked out of our lives and it's being held in computer servers and in our smartphones. And I think that's part of the reason why there's like a temporal distortion. in the sense that we really can't face the future. And I think that's part of the reason, coupled with the social collapse that's happening, the social decomposition, of why we're going into the past and really almost colonizing the past. I mean, these kind of ridiculous rip-off movies that we're doing and television shows, I mean, it just speaks to a culture that is in the process of slowly decomposing or rapidly decomposing.
Well, yeah, just from a personal point of view, thinking about the movie remakes, I mean, are any of them ever better than the original? You know,
never.
However you want to judge that. The only one that springs to mind was that I think John Carpenter's The Thing was more fully realized than the earlier black and white movie. But
okay, yeah.
There's very, very few. So it's recycling, but each iteration is degraded. You know, in the way that information, copied from format to format,
sure.
gradually decays. You know, that the resolution is lost over time. So a bit like, speaking as someone who used to be a fan of, record decks and, hi-fi separates, or good amplifier, good speakers, good cassette deck. Remember cassette decks? And now you have young people downloading their music from, especially if it's illegal sources. What's the resolution of that audio file? But it doesn't matter, because what do you compare that to? That's what gets lost, I think, sometimes in these questions, is like, how would you determine if something is degraded if you've got nothing to compare it to? Sure. Yes, I would agree with that. And that's, the whole world is becoming a simulated copy of itself. And everything is being put into technological circulation, which is killing the very idea of originality. I mean, now it's like you only exist if you can be replicated, if your image or what you have produced can be put into technological circulation. So that is another feature of 21st century globalization and the horizon of neoliberal technologies.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizedfreedom.com.
legalizedfreedom.com